In Newaygo, Michigan, single father Bob Siders leaves to work the night shift at the local bottling plant. His only daughter, 18-year-old Shannon, spends the evening with friends. When Bob returns home the next morning, Shannon is gone. And the town of Newaygo would be haunted with the question for 25 years. Who killed Shannon Siders?
The 17th of July. That was the last time I saw Shannon alive. I was working for Pepsi-Cola on third shift. I started at midnight, and I got out at 8:30 in the morning. And when I come home, Shannon was nowhere to be found. I made a few phone calls to a couple of friends and asked if she was with them. Called some parents to find out if possibly they knew where Shannon was. I actually went outside and hollered around the neighborhood because sometimes she'd be around the neighbor's house and there was no response. I finally went to the local state police post and reported her as a missing person. My daughter, she was a typical young child growing up, inquisitive. When she was younger, my wife decided she didn't want to stay married anymore, so we ended up getting divorced, and I got custody. So I ended up raising Shannon. She was missing. Let's find her and bring her home.
There were so many different things that Bob did to get the word out about his daughter. He did everything he could in his power to say, hey, my daughter is missing. What do you know about this?
I had missing person flyers printed up and sent copies of the flyers to every police post in the state.
There were a lot of sightings around town. People that knew her came into the police and said, I saw her, and they were certain that it was her. One of the tips that came in indicated that there was a Shannon hiding out at a drug house in a nearby town. The girl was hiding from her father, and she didn't want to go home. Police go out to the dope house. This is a small community. How many Shannons could be hiding from their dad? Unfortunately, it wasn't the right Shannon.
After Shannon went missing, people are talking, rumors are flying. I was 15 years old working at the sheriff's department. I answer a phone call. The voice was excited. He was almost yelling into the phone. He said, I just killed Shannon Siders. And then he hung up. I didn't know what to do. I just started crying. The detective at the time talked to me about the phone call.
It was chased down extensively, but nothing came from it.
At the time that phone call came in, we had only known that she'd been missing. I thought, my God, maybe Shannon had been murdered.
It was Labor Day weekend of 1989. Two individuals were out in the woods, kind of in the middle of the forest where it was off the beaten path. And they came across two separate pieces of identification.
The cards both had Shannon's name on it.
One of the Michigan State Troopers went out to the location where these cards were found. In addition to the cards, there was a pair of blue jeans.
If the jeans do belong to Shannon, then that would lead me to believe that something probably pretty bad had happened to her.
The area where these things were found, they called it the Hole in the Woods. It was a well-known party spot for local kids.
I'd gone out there myself in my teenage years, but didn't know that that was the spot where they went.
Bob Siders went out and looked in the area.
And I, at that point, was fearing the worst. I was looking for either a body or a grave. You talk about ESP and communicating with the dead. I believe in some of that. I think some people have that ability, not everybody. And I've determined that I don't. Because she didn't say, "Dad, I'm over here."
The south end of the Manistee National Forest. This is the same location where Shannon's 2 pieces of identification had been found a month earlier. In western Michigan, deer hunting is a big deal. So a hunter was walking back into the plantings of the red pine plantation. The hunter went to the state police post in Newaygo and reported it.
We got a phone call about 10 o'clock, and my girlfriend at the time, Linda, answered the phone. And I had trouble with this part. And she said, "When he used to talk to you?" She was the owner of a local bar and restaurant that we frequented. So she gave me the phone. And she said, "Bob, they found the body up here and they think it's Shannon. And the police are looking for you." I said, "Okay." I got to the state police post around midnight. They were waiting for me. And I talked to Detective Miller. He told me, had I gone up into the wood line, I would have found her. That's where she was.
Shannon's body was found almost 3 months to the day from when she was reported missing. Local medical examiner was brought in. The injuries were examined thoroughly. She had several injuries in several different locations. She was brutally beaten, and ultimately the cause of death was blunt force trauma to her head.
There was evidence to suggest that she had been victim to rape due to the position she was found on her back with her legs somewhat spread.
Her shirt was pulled up above where her breasts would have been, and her panties were pulled down and were only around one leg.
The skin around her perineum, around her genitalia, appeared to have been incised or cut. There was some mutilation. You're either dealing with a sick son of a bitch or you're dealing with somebody trying to dispose of some evidence.
I went to the local funeral home and made the arrangements for the funeral. One thing I knew for sure, she'd been in the woods for 3 months. I never viewed her, didn't want to. For the pallbearers, I had some difficulty with that. Because I felt that whoever killed her knew her. Not knowing who killed her, how do you pick pallbearers? I didn't use any of her friends, buddies, crowd that she hung with because of that. So I used cousins, and they were all females. Nobody knew who did it. So somebody's still out there. And I said, I don't want somebody that killed her to be a pallbearer.
At the funeral, almost the entire high school was there. Shannon was the type of person that you could tell anything to without judgment. She was sweet and caring. I know that we would have always been a part of each other's life.
A couple of friends wanted to know if they could write a letter and leave other remembrances in the casket, and I told them they could. They were to Shannon, they were given to Shannon, so I don't know what they said.
The original investigators had asked the Michigan State Police behavioral analysis team to build a profile to try to find any potential killers.
The profiler unit in Lansing believed that Shannon was likely killed by someone within her peer group, and her age group, by more than one perpetrator. And there was a good chance that alcohol and drugs were a factor.
And they said this was most likely a sexually motivated homicide.
And also that she was likely killed by someone that she knew. It had a pretty big impact in the city of Newaygo. Being a small community, it was especially shocking for an 18-year-old girl who was well-liked, did not have enemies, to be brutally murdered.
It was scary because when you think about something like this could happen in a small town, it could be your neighbor. It could be the person right next door. How scary is that? There were so many rumors going around the schools, pointing fingers at different people.
There are some cases where the person responsible for the murder has taken something from their victim, kept it as a trophy or some type of memento.
I knew she had a class ring. I know her initials were on it, and I know there was an inscription. It was never found in the house, and so it was never found where the body was.
Now they had to go back and build on that timeline that they started based on the missing persons report.
When Shannon was found, there was a forensic entomologist brought in to help try and determine a timeline as to when she was killed. The entomologist looks at what type of bugs and larvae are on the body and in what cycle they're in. I would say it's fairly uncommon to use an entomologist because we don't get a lot of cases where a body is dumped out in the woods and it's not found for weeks or months. People are usually found a lot sooner, even murder victims.
The entomologist was able to determine that it was somewhere, the last couple weeks of July to the first week of August. Prior to that, the investigators didn't know who she was with, where she had been.
Investigators were looking for the one person that was last with Shannon. And it turns out there were 8 people that last saw Shannon alive.
I was very confident that one of the local kids in that group that night knew something about the case, but they were either afraid to come forward or unwilling to come forward. Now we have 8 suspects we have to either confirm or eliminate as being responsible.
Investigators talked to all 8 of these kids in detail at police stations, on recording for those willing, taking polygraphs, and tried to rule them out one by one.
From those interviews, the original investigators are able to develop a timeline, backtracking where she was that night. Shannon's father worked 3rd shift in Grand Rapids, so that night he left the house about 10:30. Shannon was still home.
After Shannon's dad goes to work, she ended up meeting up with some people that she knew.
The kids in this group, they were local kids, liked to hang out, and they'd all kind of gone to school together.
It was a typical group of teenagers whose real focus was partying. I would not have called that group her good friends.
And that group of friends, 8 other individuals that were all together that night in 3 separate cars. They eventually ended up at the hole in the woods. Drinking, smoking, driving around the trails in the forest. And later that night, Shannon wanted to go home.
She had been riding around with Levi Pearson and Brandon Sievers.
If there was trouble, his name was associated.
Brandon, she didn't like being alone with him. He just gave you the creeps.
Brandon Sievers was someone who didn't think highly of a lot of women. People that knew him said that he would often refer to women as sluts and whores and things like that. There were some tips coming in saying that Brandon had left town shortly after Shannon went missing. Made him look suspicious. There were some tips coming in saying that Brandon had left town shortly after Shannon went missing. Made him look suspicious. Brandon Sievers was brought in.
From what we read in the interviews, Shannon was riding around in the car with Brandon.
He said that Shannon wanted to go home.
When the opportunity came up for her to get into a car with someone else, she did.
Brandon said that he didn't see Shannon after that. The original investigators asked why Brandon had left town, and were able to determine that he went out to Colorado just to pick up a cousin to bring him back. It wasn't like he left to move out there to stay away for months. He was gone a day or two.
The kids told investigators that Shannon got into a car with Paul and Matt Jones.
Paul and Matt Jones were brothers that grew up south of Newaygo. The original plan was that they were going to go back to Shannon's house and watch movies and drink beer.
The group ended up separating from there, and Shannon was with Paul and Matt Jones at that point. And Paul and Matt, they claimed that they dropped Shannon off at home.
They gave a pretty detailed description of dropping Shannon off at her house anywhere between midnight and 2 a.m. They described the house, the fact that there was a porch light on, they saw a TV on, and they even saw Shannon's dog running within the house.
The original investigators looked extensively into Matt and Paul Jones' story.
The investigators retraced the route that these kids drove to Shannon's house.
They saw Shannon's dog moving around inside of the house.
You could see the TV through one of the windows, and that there was a porch light. It led the investigators to believe that what they were saying was truthful.
The Jones brothers took a polygraph and passed it.
Everybody in the group was looked at extensively. Those individuals didn't provide anything fruitful to the discovery of who killed Shannon.
People wanted to think that it was a stranger. That would have been the easiest. But the fact that she was found in such a remote spot that was known to local people made that hard to stay with.
Everybody thought somebody else did it.
It changed the way I functioned during the day. Things like that just didn't happen here.
The longer an investigation draws out without finding those responsible, you're not receiving as much information and you're not getting as many leads to follow up on.
Tips slowed way down. At certain points, they didn't come in at all. The investigation didn't have any traction. So, over the years, the case went cold.
There's not a day goes by I don't think about her. How old would her children be? Would she be a grandmother by now? We lost a very special person in our lives.
It becomes a hole in your heart. She was my only child. I never remarried. and I'll never have grandchildren. The fact remained that there was a killer out there among us, and nobody knew who it was. I rented a billboard, and I got 45 or 50 people on the M37 corridor to put "Who killed Shannon Sider?" Somebody knows something. I knew I had to keep it out there in the public's eye.
You'd get kind of a chill when you would see him. Everybody needed to be careful because things hadn't been solved.
I started in Newaygo as chief in 2000. Part of the reason I took the job in Newaygo was the case. I wanted the case solved. Shannon's case was like a cancer in the community. It was something that people knew was there. It just never went away.
We had new administration in our district, and they wanted to put a cold case task force together.
And when I was asked to be on the team, without hesitation, I accepted. Finding those responsible for the murder of Shannon, that was the reason I became a police officer.
I've always felt that it was a solvable case if you got the right people and the right information. I agreed with Bob. Someone knows something.
First thing that we do is we need to learn who Shannon Siders is. We call it victimology interviews. We're basically studying our victim to see if Shannon or Shannon's lifestyle will lead us to her killer.
We talked to all of Shannon's family, her close friends, her acquaintances, just to find out who Shannon was.
Through the victimology, it was pretty well known that Shannon always wore her class ring on her right hand. It wasn't in any of Shannon's personal belongings that were left behind at home. The ring is missing. This was something that was held back. The police didn't advertise this. If we could find the ring, we could find the person that killed Shannon Siders.
For Pat, I think it was important to, if the ring was out there, he wanted to find it. That would be a crucial piece of evidence.
If it still existed, first thing that needed to be eliminated was the ring laying out there where Shannon was murdered. Some years back, I got into metal detecting just as a hobby. I went out many times and looked in that area for Shannon's class ring. Lots of bullets. I think I dug up every bullet within 200 yards of where her body was found. You know, in the back of my mind, I was always hopeful that the ring would show up somewhere.
I never did stop thinking about Shannon. I worked at the Sheriff's Department during the summer when I was 15 years old, and I didn't stop thinking about that phone call. So I decided, I'm going to solve this murder. My motivation behind it was justice for this family.
She basically became like a dog after a bone. She became a detective, and she wasn't a detective.
I'm talking to 10 people a day some days. Some were very frustrated with me because it's not like I accused everybody, but I looked at everybody like they could have done it.
It was the talk of the town again. There is no ignoring the fact that social media is now an everyday facet of our lives. And people say things on a keyboard that they may not say in real life. That's why I started the Facebook page. I literally set the page up and bing, instant message from Amy. That's how I met her. She had no concept of what we were doing, and I told her, if you have information, give it to us, unfiltered, and just give it to us, and don't expect anything in return.
Amy Bonner is a civilian. She was working in her own capacity, trying to generate tips, trying to help solve the case.
People started thinking that Amy organized the Facebook page, and I was more than happy to let them think that.
I received this Facebook message from a gal named Stephanie, and she tells me a story of her family and the possibility that they were involved in Shannon's murder.
The Hammond family is a local family. They have a bad reputation.
So much incest and abuse and crazy stuff went on in that family. Stephanie tells me that there is a house on the lake that has a creek that runs underneath of it. Stephanie tells me Shannon was raped there by several people after being drugged. Stephanie claims that they kept her there for a couple of days. Then they took her from that location by a van out into the woods. And then they ran her over. So I asked her to bring me there. When she brought me to that house, and I saw that there was, in fact, a creek running underneath that house, my mind is running wild thinking, oh my God, what did Shannon go through? So if that house has to be true, I knew this had to be it. The day that I was taken to the house, I felt an emotional connection to Shannon. I can feel the pain of what they put her through. So I immediately called Pat Hedlund.
All appearances from the street, it's just a normal house on a lake. But as we pull up, there's a creek under it. And it's kind of like, wow, there is a house like that. Maybe something happened to Shannon in the basement of this house. The homeowners, several of the family members were convicted of serious assaults, attempted murder. The information was that Shannon had been raped in the basement and held for days. But the house has no basement. It's never had a basement. And when we look at the Hammond family, we talk to everyone that we could find in their life. There's no evidence that they had any involvement with Shannon and her murder. Amy was a pain in the butt sometimes, but I can't fault somebody for being obsessed with a case when I'm the very same person.
Was I obsessed? Absolutely, I was. I did receive a few death threats. I felt that I was getting the death threats because I was getting close to the truth, but I wasn't about to stop.
At this point in the investigation, there was still one thing that we wanted to do. We knew that there had been letters placed in the casket at the funeral, and police had never read those letters.
There's a tip that indicated that there might have even been a confession letter in Shannon's casket.
It wasn't an easy decision to make because that's pretty sensitive to have to bring someone out of their final resting place.
So with the blessing of Bob Siders, we actually were wielding shovels and digging Shannon up.
There were a handful of letters.
The letters were letters from friends telling her how much they loved her and how they were going to miss her. We didn't find a confession letter, unfortunately.
And then Mike says, I think we've discovered something.
She had some hair in her right hand. Glob of hair found on any victim's hand, I would assume that they probably fought back and got it from that person. So we resubmitted these items to have them tested for the presence of DNA to see if they could obtain a profile, something that we could compare to a possible suspect.
But the hair they found belonged to Shannon. There was next to no physical evidence to help us try and link a potential suspect.
The exhumation was no more disappointing than chasing down all these leads that needed to be chased down and nothing coming from them. It was a stone that had to be turned over. It had to be done.
During the investigation, we interviewed approximately 400 people. We talked to all the people that knew Shannon. That led us to Julia Littich. Julia Littich was a friend of Shannon's.
Julia had been interviewed by the original detectives, but the information that she brought was not in the original file.
I got off of work at 10, and then I started looking for Shannon. I knew that she was going to run an errand and then connect with me after 10 when I got out of work. The first time I went over there, it would have been about 11:30, 11:45, and she wasn't home. About every half hour, I would go over again, knocking on the door. I even went in at one point, ran up to her room, and she wasn't there. The last time that I went was 2:45 a.m. on the 18th.
Originally, in 1989, Paul and Matt Jones tell investigators, we took her home.
We were gonna go into Shannon's and drink beer and watch TV. When we got there, she said she was too tired, she was gonna go to bed. And so we dropped her off.
What time of night was it that you last saw her?
12 or 1 or a little after. Well, as we drive by, I seen TV on, I seen her jumping.
Someone was lying.
From the original investigation, we began finding people that had contact with Paul and Matt Jones during the time of Shannon's disappearance.
Lindsay Bradley came up in the original investigation as a friend of Shannon's. She also dated Paul Jones. Lindsay came in and talked to us.
She said that she was in the company of Paul Jones riding around in his car with him.
She saw something in Paul's ashtray.
She said there was a female's class ring in the ashtray in Paul's vehicle.
Lindsay Bradley was friends with Shannon. She also dated Paul Jones. Lindsay told us about a class ring that she saw in Paul's ashtray. She confronted him and said, "You're asking me on a date when you have another girl's class ring." And then he said, "Let's face it, she's probably dead."
Why would he say, let's face it, she's probably dead? It doesn't seem like a normal person would want to implicate themselves.
That said to me that maybe that was Shannon's class ring, and that Paul and Matt Jones killed her.
Because of the class ring in the ashtray of Paul's car, we believe They could have talked Shannon into going out to another party spot. But it turns out there was no party. It was just the three of them.
We believe there was some attempt at sexual advances and Shannon resisted. And they didn't want to take no for an answer.
Every piece of information that came in was pointing towards Paul and Matt Jones.
But it's definitely a circumstantial case at this point. We needed to make a case through confession, eyewitness testimony, physical evidence. Somebody had to know something.
During this investigation, I talked to hundreds of people. And several people told me I should talk to Jenny Corrigan. Jenny Corrigan was always a friend, so I called her. She came over, and I said, Jenny, for God's sake, you've been my friend all this time, and you know I've been working on this case for years. Are you kidding me? What do you know about Shannon Siders? She tells me she knew how Shannon was killed. I was so caught off guard. She's crying hysterically, telling me the story about what happened and what she had seen. I immediately called Pat Hedlund and said, I have an eyewitness.
Jenny told us she may have seen something relevant to what happened to Shannon that night.
That's a very unusual statement to make about a 20-some-year-old murder. Where was she in 1989?
She never came forward because she was worried about retaliation by the suspects. Jenny told us that we needed to talk to Dean Robinson.
We found Dean, and then Dean and Jenny were able to describe exactly what happened that night.
On the night that Shannon disappeared, Jenny Corrigan had not been with Shannon and the group of 8 kids. She was riding around with Dean Robinson. They came across a car that was parked. Dean ended up having a conversation with the driver of this other vehicle while Jenny stayed in the car. Jenny heard the person identify themselves as Jones. She overheard the driver say that they were looking for a girl. This definitely suggests that Shannon had gotten away from Matt and Paul Jones at some point.
And now they were hunting her.
Dean and Paul Jones parted ways. Eventually, Paul and Matt Jones were able to find Shannon.
They caught up to her. They beat her bad.
We believe this was a sexually motivated crime. And they took turns raping her.
And they crushed her skull. It wasn't just an assault. It was brutal enough where they knew that they were killing her. Later, Dean and Jenny came back through, and they see the same 2 brothers standing outside of the car with a girl laying unconscious or lifeless on the ground. Dean got out, started to run up to see if he could help, and tripped and fell. Dean recognized that it was Shannon Siders. And that's when he described Paul Jones coming over and kicking him in the face. Matt Jones is coming around the back of their car with a hammer of some sort.
And then once Matt had found out someone else was in the car, he decided to retreat.
After Dean's statement, There's no denying that Paul and Matt Jones killed Shannon Siders.
If we were to identify this person that did this, do you have any personal preference what should happen to the guy?
Yeah. Lock him up for good.
Pardon?
Lock him up for good.
Lock him up for good.
Yeah. Solitude.
Okay.
I have no doubt that the information that I gave to Pat Hedlund was instrumental in how this case was solved. That day, Pat called me and told me that they were making arrests. I screamed, cried, screamed.
You're not supposed to bury your children. Your children are supposed to bury you, but life goes on. She would have been 45. But I'm sure she would have had children. She wanted to be a mom, and she would have been a good mother. So I would have had grandchildren. I missed all that. All the stuff that goes with your daughter becoming a woman and getting married, giving you grandchildren, the ups and downs of their life. And hopefully they have a better life than you had. But we got justice. And Shannon finally got the justice he deserved.
There are murders that remain in public memory because of the brutality of the crime. There are others that remain because the final judgment seems almost impossible to reconcile with what happened. The killing of Betty Gore belongs to both categories. On June 13, 1980, in the quiet Texas town of Wiley, Betty Gore was killed inside her own home. The weapon was an axe. The person who used it was not a stranger breaking through a window in the darkness, but Candy Montgomery, a woman who had belonged to the same social and religious world as Betty. Candy was a wife, a mother, a homemaker, and a familiar face in the local church community. She was also the wife of another family man, the mother of 2 children, and, until the events that preceded the murder, someone whose life appeared outwardly stable. What makes the case so difficult to understand is not simply the violence. It is the distance between the appearance of ordinary life and the private conflict that existed beneath it. 2 families had lived within the same community. They attended the same church, shared social activities, played volleyball, went on outings, and took part in the routines that made their world seem safe and predictable. Behind that familiar surface, however, Candy Montgomery and Alan Gore had entered into an affair. Alan was Betty Gore's husband. By the time of Betty's death, that affair was supposed to have ended. Yet the secret had already changed the relationships among the people involved. To understand the murder, it is necessary to begin before the bloodshed, in the ordinary world that surrounded it. Wiley, Texas, at the end of the 1970s, was presented in this case as a small, peaceful town where young families pursued a version of the American dream. Private homes, family routines, church life, social gatherings, and professional careers formed the background. Candy Montgomery, 30 years old, was married to Pat Montgomery, an electrical engineer. They had 2 children. Candy was described as active, interested in sports, and involved in church activities. She was a member of the Lucas Methodist Church and participated in the community around it. The Gore family occupied a similar place in that world. Alan Gore worked as an engineer at Texas Instruments. Betty had been a teacher before leaving that work after the birth of her children. They had 2 daughters, Elisa and the infant Bethany. The families knew each other through church and shared many ordinary activities. Their relationship was close enough that the boundaries between friendship and family life could easily appear comfortable and familiar. That familiarity would later make the killing even harder for the community to absorb. In 1978, during a church volleyball gathering, Candy became attracted to Alan Gore. According to the account provided in this case, she approached him directly about the possibility of an affair. Alan initially refused. He was concerned about his marriage and about what such a relationship could destroy. Eventually, however, he agreed to a secret relationship with Candy. The affair was not presented as a reckless relationship without boundaries. Instead, Candy and Alan established rules intended to keep their private meetings separate from their families. They would meet during the day. They would use motels in nearby towns. They would avoid calling home while they were together. Most importantly, they would try to prevent the affair from affecting their marriages and children. For a time, the arrangement continued. But secrecy does not erase consequences. Betty eventually became suspicious of her husband. After the birth of the couple's second daughter, she was exhausted and was described as experiencing signs of postpartum depression. She sensed that Alan was becoming distant. Eventually, she confronted him directly and asked whether he had been unfaithful. Alan admitted the affair. He told Betty that the relationship with Candy had ended. Candy, for her part, accepted that the affair was over and returned to the life she had been trying to protect. Her marriage, her children, her church community, and the ordinary routines of a suburban family. Yet the fact that the affair had ended did not mean that its consequences had ended with it. On the morning of June 13, 1980, Alan Gore was away on a business trip. Candy went to Betty's house for a reason that appeared completely ordinary. She intended to collect a swimsuit belonging to Elisa because Candy's daughter was planning to go swimming with her. There was nothing about that errand that, on its surface, suggested violence. Candy arrived at the Gore home at approximately 10 in the morning. Betty was there. The two women spoke for several minutes. At some point, according to Candy's later account, the conversation turned to the affair between Candy and Alan. The exact words that transformed the conversation into a confrontation are not known. What is known is that the encounter moved toward the rear area of the house, near the laundry room, where an axe was present. From that point, the case depends heavily on Candy's account of what happened. Candy said that Betty was the first to take hold of the axe. She described a struggle between the two women. According to her version, she managed to take control of the weapon and then struck Betty in self-defense. The physical evidence created a disturbing contrast with that explanation. Betty was struck 41 times with the axe. The injuries affected multiple areas of her body, including her head, face, shoulders, back, and legs. Investigators concluded that some of the blows occurred when Betty was already close to being unable to resist. That number, 41, would become one of the defining facts of the case. It also became the central question surrounding Candy's claim of self-defense. If a person is attacked and responds with deadly force, where does self-defense end and intentional killing begin? At what moment does fear become rage, panic become uncontrolled violence, or survival become something else? In this case, the answer would ultimately be decided not by the public, but by a jury. Inside the Gore home, the scene was devastating. Blood was present across the area where the attack had occurred, including the walls, door, floor, and washing machine. The axe was covered in blood. The horror was compounded by the presence of Bethany, the infant daughter, who remained alive in her crib in another part of the house. The child had been inside the home while her mother was killed. That detail would remain among the most painful elements of the case. Betty was not simply a name in a court record. She was a mother whose children depended upon her, a wife whose husband was away, and a woman whose ordinary morning ended inside the home where she expected to be safe. After the killing, Candy left the house. The account provided states that she washed her feet and hands, left the residence, and continued with the day, including taking the children swimming. To people who later learned what had happened, this behavior was difficult to understand. Some saw it as evidence of preparation or calculation. Candy maintained that she had been in shock. Meanwhile, Alan Gore tried repeatedly to reach his home. He could not get an answer. Eventually, a neighbor was asked to check the house. Betty's body was discovered, and police began to secure the scene. The investigation quickly moved toward the most obvious question: who could have entered the house and killed Betty? At first, investigators considered possibilities including burglary, an intruder, or someone known to the family. But there was no clear indication that robbery was the motive. As investigators learned more about the relationships surrounding Betty, attention turned toward the secret that connected Candy Montgomery to Alan Gore. Candy became the primary suspect. The case had now crossed a decisive line. What had begun as a seemingly ordinary visit between two women from the same community had become a homicide investigation. The friendship, the affair, The confrontation, the axe, the 41 blows, and Candy's claim of self-defense were now pieces of the same unanswered question. Did Candy Montgomery kill Betty Gore because she intended to kill her, or did she act in a moment of extreme fear and panic? That question would follow Candy from the investigation into the courtroom. And in the courtroom, the answer would shock Texas and beyond for years. Before Betty Gore became the victim at the center of one of Texas's most controversial murder cases, she was simply a woman living an ordinary life in a small community. Her name would later be repeated in newspapers, documentaries, podcasts, books, and television dramas, often beside the name of the woman who killed her. But behind the case was a family, 2 young daughters, a husband, and a home that had once represented safety. Betty lived in Wiley, Texas, with her husband, Alan, and their 2 daughters, Elisa and the infant Bethany. Their family occupied a familiar place in the community. Alan worked as an engineer at Texas Instruments. Betty had been a teacher, but after the birth of her children, she left that work and devoted herself to her family. Their life was built around the routines of marriage, parenthood, work, church, and relationships with people they knew well. The Gores were not isolated from the people around them. They belonged to the same church community as Candy and Pat Montgomery. Their families were connected through social activities and shared interests. They played volleyball together, attended outings, and participated in gatherings that reflected the close social world of the community. To anyone looking from the outside, there was little reason to imagine that these relationships contained the possibility of tragedy. Candy Montgomery appeared to fit comfortably into that same environment. She was 30 years old, married to Pat Montgomery, an electrical engineer, and the mother of 2 children. She was active, enjoyed sports, and participated in church activities. She attended Lucas Methodist Church and was known within that community. The Montgomery and Gore families therefore existed within the same circle of familiarity. The person who entered Betty Gore's home on June 13, 1980, was not a stranger. Candy was someone Betty knew. She was someone whose family had shared social space with hers. She was connected to Betty through the same community that had made their lives seem secure. Yet the relationship between the 2 families concealed something Betty eventually discovered. In 1978, Candy became attracted to Alan Gore during a church volleyball gathering. According to the account provided, Candy approached Alan directly about the possibility of an affair. Alan initially refused. He was concerned about his marriage and about the consequences of becoming involved with another woman. Eventually, however, he agreed. The relationship was conducted secretly. Candy and Alan established rules intended to keep the affair separate from their family lives. They would meet during the day. They would use motels in nearby towns. They would not call home while they were together. They would also try to prevent the relationship from interfering with their marriages and children. For a time, the arrangement continued. But secrecy does not erase consequences. Betty eventually became suspicious of her husband. After the birth of her second daughter, Betty was dealing with exhaustion and signs of postpartum depression. At the same time, she sensed that Alan was becoming more distant. The changes in her husband's behavior created suspicion, and eventually Betty confronted him directly. She asked Alan whether he had been unfaithful. Alan admitted that he had been involved with Candy. He also told Betty that the relationship had ended. Candy, for her part, accepted that the affair was over and returned to the life she had been trying to protect. Her marriage, her children, her church community, and the ordinary routines of a suburban family. The families continued to exist in the same community, carrying the knowledge of what had happened. There was no dramatic disappearance, no public confrontation that permanently divided the community, and no obvious sign that a deadly encounter was approaching. Instead, the people involved continued living within the same social environment. Alan continued working as an engineer. Betty remained focused on her children. Candy remained a mother and homemaker. The church remained part of their lives. The children remained at the center of their families. The future still appeared to contain the possibility of normality. Then came June 13th. Alan was away on a business trip that morning. Candy went to the Gore home to collect a swimsuit belonging to Elisa because Candy's daughter was planning to go swimming with her. It was an ordinary reason for one mother to visit another. Betty was at home with the infant Bethany. The account provided states that Candy arrived at approximately 10 in the morning. She and Betty spoke for several minutes. At some point, the conversation turned toward the affair. What precisely was said is not known. There is no complete surviving record of their private conversation. That absence matters because the moments immediately preceding the violence became central to the question of self-defense. The two women eventually moved toward the rear portion of the house, near the laundry area. An axe was present there. According to Candy's account, Betty took the axe first. The two women struggled over it. Candy said that she gained control of the weapon and then struck Betty in self-defense. What followed was fatal. Betty was struck 41 times with the axe. 41 blows meant that the killing was not a single instantaneous act. It involved repeated strikes, and the nature and distribution of the injuries became crucial to the later arguments about what had happened. Betty suffered wounds to her head, face, shoulders, back, and legs. Investigators concluded that some injuries were inflicted when she was already close to being unable to resist. The physical scene inside the home was horrifying. Blood covered portions of the walls, door, floor, and washing machine. The axe was covered with blood. And somewhere within that same home was Bethany. The infant remained alive in her crib, while her mother lay dead elsewhere in the house. Betty's death, therefore, did not end with the violence itself. It immediately created another human tragedy. Her children had lost their mother. For Alan, the tragedy unfolded through distance. He was away when Betty was killed. Later that day, he tried repeatedly to contact the house and received no answer. The unanswered calls became increasingly alarming. He eventually asked a neighbor to check on the family. The discovery of Betty's body transformed a private family tragedy into a criminal investigation. For the community, the shock was intensified by the identity of the victim. Betty had not been a distant figure whose death could be explained through a world of crime unfamiliar to them. She was a wife, a mother, a former teacher, and a member of a shared church community. Her husband was known. Her children were known. Her home was known. The killing forced people to look again at the relationships they believed they understood. Candy and Betty had occupied neighboring positions within the same social world. One was now dead. The other was the person who admitted causing her death. Yet the story was still not complete. The investigators had to determine what happened inside that house. They had to consider whether an outsider could have entered, whether the killing could have been connected to robbery, and whether someone close to Betty had a reason to harm her. The absence of an obvious robbery motive pushed attention toward the people connected to Betty. The affair between Candy and Alan provided investigators with a crucial connection. Candy was no longer simply the woman who had visited the house that morning. She was a person linked to the victim's husband through a secret relationship that Betty had discovered. That connection did not by itself answer the question of motive. It did, however, establish a reason for investigators to examine Candy's account closely. The central mystery was becoming sharper. Betty was dead. Candy admitted that she had killed her. The weapon was known. The violence was established. But the meaning of those 41 blows remained unresolved. Was Betty attacking Candy when the struggle began? Did Candy truly believe she was fighting for her life? Or had the confrontation become something more after the immediate danger had passed? Those questions would define the investigation and eventually the courtroom battle. But before a jury could decide whether Candy was guilty or innocent, investigators had to reconstruct what happened inside the Gore home on that June morning. Every relationship, every statement, and every piece of physical evidence would have to be examined against Candy's version of events. And at the center of it all remained Betty Gore, whose final moments had occurred not in a dangerous public place, but inside the home where she was raising her children. Her absence would reshape both families and haunt the community for decades. Her story would become inseparable from Candy's. But they were not the same story. One woman walked out of the house alive. The other never walked out at all. The discovery of Betty Gore's body transformed what had begun as an ordinary Friday morning into a homicide investigation. When investigators entered the house, they were confronted with a scene that immediately demanded an explanation. Betty had been killed inside her own home, and the violence was impossible to ignore. Blood was present on the walls, the door, the floor, and the washing machine. The axe was covered with blood. Betty had suffered 41 blows, with injuries affecting her head, face, shoulders, back, and legs. For investigators, the first task was not to understand Candy Montgomery's state of mind. It was to determine what had happened and who was responsible. The circumstances initially allowed for several possibilities. Investigators considered robbery, an intruder, or someone known to the family. But the absence of an apparent robbery quickly made that explanation less convincing. The killing had taken place during the day, inside Betty's home, and there was no indication from the information provided that property had been taken. The scene therefore pointed toward a confrontation rather than a crime motivated by theft. The condition of the house also raised a more difficult question. The weapon was not a firearm or some object brought into the home for the purpose of killing. It was an axe kept there for ordinary household use. That meant the investigation had to determine how such an ordinary object had become the instrument of a fatal attack. As detectives examined the circumstances surrounding Betty's life, they learned about her relationship with Alan Gore and, eventually, about Candy Montgomery. That discovery became the turning point. Candy was not a stranger who had appeared unexpectedly in Betty's home. She was a friend. Their families belonged to the same church community. They had spent time together socially, participated in recreational activities, and shared the routines of suburban life. The connection made the killing more difficult to understand, but it also gave investigators a possible motive. The affair between Candy and Alan was no longer a private matter between two people. It had become relevant to a murder investigation. The history was important. In 1978, Candy had approached Alan and asked whether he wanted to have an affair. Alan initially refused because he loved Betty and feared destroying his family. Eventually, however, the two entered into the relationship. They attempted to control it through specific rules. Their meetings took place during the day. They used motels in nearby towns. They avoided calling home while together. They also agreed that the affair would not be allowed to interfere with their marriages and families. For a time, the arrangement appeared to work. But Betty eventually became suspicious. After giving birth to her second daughter, Betty was dealing with exhaustion and signs of postpartum depression. She also felt that Alan was becoming increasingly distant. At one point, she directly asked him whether he was having an affair. Alan admitted that he had been involved with Candy, although he told Betty that the relationship had ended. Candy, according to the account provided, also accepted the end of the affair. That fact became significant because the killing occurred only months later. Investigators now had to connect the history of the affair with the events of June 13th. Candy had a legitimate reason for being at Betty's house. She had gone there to collect a swimsuit for her daughter. But she was also the woman who had previously been involved with Betty's husband. The investigation therefore centered increasingly on Candy's visit that morning. When questioned, Candy eventually admitted that she had killed Betty. That admission removed one of the most basic uncertainties in the investigation. There was no longer a question about whether Candy had been present or whether she had caused Betty's death. She acknowledged it, but she immediately placed the killing within a completely different framework. Candy said she had acted in self-defense. According to her account, Betty had taken hold of the axe first. The two women struggled over it. Candy said she managed to take control of the weapon during the struggle and then struck Betty because she was trying to protect herself. For investigators, that explanation had to be measured against the physical evidence. The number of injuries was the most difficult fact to reconcile with a simple account of self-defense. Betty had been struck 41 times. Some wounds were to areas including the head and face, while others were found on the shoulders, back, and legs. Investigators believe that some of the blows occurred when Betty was already close to being unable to resist. That raised the central question that would eventually dominate the courtroom. If Candy had initially been defending herself, at what point had the threat ended? The physical evidence could show the extent of the violence, but it could not independently establish every movement made by the two women. There was no surviving witness to the confrontation. Betty could not tell investigators whether she had reached for the axe first. She could not explain what she had said. She could not describe the struggle. She could not tell anyone when she believed the attack had begun or whether she had been attempting to defend herself. The only surviving participant was Candy. This created an extraordinary evidentiary problem. The prosecution could point to the scene and the number of injuries. The defense could point to Candy's account of the struggle. But the precise beginning and progression of the confrontation remained dependent on interpretation. Investigators also had to consider Candy's behavior after the killing. According to the investigation, she washed her feet and hands before leaving Betty's home. She then continued with the children's swimming plans. To some observers, those actions appeared remarkably controlled. A woman had just been killed inside the house, yet Candy did not remain there to summon help. She did not call emergency services. Instead, she left and continued with the day's plans. That behavior became another point of suspicion. To critics, it suggested that Candy had been sufficiently composed to make deliberate decisions after the killing. To Candy, the behavior was consistent with shock. Again, the same facts could support sharply different interpretations. The investigators also knew that Alan had been away on business. He had tried to contact his home several times without receiving an answer. Eventually, he asked a neighbor to check on Betty. The discovery of Betty's body brought the investigation into the open and established the timeline that would connect Alan, Betty, Candy, and the house. As detectives reconstructed the events, the affair emerged as the obvious personal connection between the victim and the person who admitted killing her. Yet the affair did not automatically establish motive for murder. Candy had not simply been accused of killing a woman connected to a romantic relationship. She maintained that the affair had ended and that the confrontation was not a planned killing. Her defense would later rely heavily on that distinction. The investigation therefore reached a point where ordinary homicide questions were no longer enough. It was necessary to understand not only what Candy had done, but why she claimed she had done it. That distinction became particularly important because the prosecution and defense would ultimately describe the same morning in fundamentally different ways. The prosecution could emphasize the 41 blows, the condition of Betty's body, the absence of a call for help, and Candy's actions after leaving the house. These facts could be presented as evidence that the killing had gone far beyond what would have been necessary for self-defense. The defense, however, could emphasize the alleged initial attack by Betty, the struggle over the axe, and Candy's psychological response during the confrontation. If the jury accepted that account, the number of blows could be interpreted not as proof of deliberate murder, but as the consequence of an extreme psychological state. The investigation had uncovered the weapon, the scene, the history, and the confession. But it had not uncovered the one piece of evidence that could settle the central dispute: an independent account of the confrontation itself. That missing voice belonged to Betty. As the case moved toward trial, the investigation therefore became more than an effort to establish responsibility. It became an attempt to determine which interpretation of the evidence was credible. Candy had killed Betty. She did not deny it. The unresolved question was whether the law would regard those 41 blows as an act of survival during a violent struggle or as an intentional killing that had continued after the danger had passed. That question would soon leave the investigators and enter the courtroom, where Candy's version of events would face the full weight of the prosecution's case. The evidence was disturbing. The circumstances were deeply personal, and the absence of another surviving witness meant that the ultimate decision would depend not only on what had happened inside Betty Gore's house, but on whether 12 jurors believed Candy's explanation of why it happened. The investigation had reached its most important turning point. The next stage would determine whether the woman who admitted killing Betty Gore would be held responsible for murder, or whether her claim of self-defense would ultimately prevail. The case eventually moved from the investigation into the courtroom, where the central question was no longer whether Candy Montgomery had killed Betty Gore. Candy had already admitted that she had. The question was whether the killing should be understood as murder or as an act of self-defense. The trial took place in Collin County in 1980, and Candy's defense was built around an unusual psychological explanation. Her attorney, Don Crowder, did not attempt to deny the violence or convince the jury that Candy had not been responsible for Betty's death. Instead, the defense accepted the essential fact of the killing while challenging the meaning of Candy's actions. According to Candy's account, Betty had taken the axe first. The two women struggled, and Candy eventually gained control of the weapon. She maintained that she then attacked Betty because she believed she was defending herself. The defense therefore needed the jury to accept that the confrontation had placed Candy in a state of extreme psychological distress. The number of blows remained the most troubling part of the defense. Betty had been struck 41 times. The injuries included wounds to her head, face, shoulders, back, and legs. Some of the injuries, according to the information presented in the case, appear to have occurred when Betty was already close to being unable to resist. For the prosecution, these facts offered a powerful argument that the violence had gone beyond reasonable self-defense. The prosecution emphasized that point. 41 blows, they argued, could not easily be explained as an ordinary defensive reaction. They also pointed to Candy's behavior after the killing. She had washed her feet and hands, left the house, and continued with the children's swimming plans. She had not called for emergency assistance. To the prosecution, those actions suggested a level of control that was difficult to reconcile with the idea that Candy had simply been reacting to an immediate threat. Don Crowder's strategy focused on Candy's psychological state. He presented the argument that Candy had experienced a trauma-related reaction rooted in experiences from her childhood. A therapist named Fred Faison appeared as an expert witness and described the possibility that Candy could enter a dissociative state during the confrontation. The explanation centered on the significance of the command "shh." According to the defense account, Candy had experienced a childhood in which her mother had pressured her to remain silent. When Betty shouted "shh" during the confrontation, the sound allegedly triggered those buried memories. Candy, under this interpretation, entered a state of dissociation and lost normal control over her behavior. This argument offered the jury a way to understand the extraordinary violence without requiring them to conclude that Candy had calmly decided to kill her friend. The defense was not simply asking the jurors to ignore the 41 wounds. It was asking them to interpret those wounds through the psychological condition it claimed had overtaken Candy during the encounter. The prosecution, however, challenged that interpretation. The state emphasized the physical evidence and the circumstances surrounding the killing. Betty had suffered an extraordinary number of injuries, and the prosecution argued that Candy had enough opportunity to stop. If Betty was already unable to resist, then continued blows could not be justified simply by claiming that the confrontation had begun as self-defense. The prosecution also had to confront a fundamental weakness in the case. There was no surviving witness to the confrontation. Betty could not tell the jury what happened. There was no independent eyewitness who could confirm whether she had taken the axe first or whether Candy had initiated the physical violence. The jury therefore had to evaluate competing versions of the same event. One version began with Betty attacking Candy and ended with Candy escaping a terrifying confrontation. The other viewed the killing as an intentional act that continued far beyond any immediate threat. The psychological evidence became especially significant because the defense was offering the jurors an explanation for behavior that otherwise appeared almost impossible to understand. The image of a woman repeatedly striking another woman with an axe was difficult to reconcile with the outward image of Candy Montgomery as a church-going suburban mother. The defense sought to bridge that gap by arguing that Candy's mind had entered a dissociative state. This was an unusual strategy in Texas at the time. Rather than relying only on the physical circumstances of the struggle, the defense invited the jury to consider what might have been happening inside Candy's mind. That approach did not erase Betty's suffering. It did, however, change the legal question from a simple examination of the violence to a broader question about Candy's perception of danger and her psychological response. The trial consequently became a contest over interpretation. The prosecution could show the jury the consequences of the attack. The defense could offer Candy's explanation of the moments that led to it. Neither side could produce Betty's account. Those hours represented the final stage of a case that had begun with an ordinary visit to a friend's house and had become a murder prosecution. The jury had to consider the affair between Candy and Alan, Betty's discovery of that affair, the confrontation inside the house, the axe, the 41 injuries, Candy's conduct afterward, her admission, and the psychological explanation offered by the defense. After roughly 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. The decision stunned many people who had followed the case. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was delivered. For Betty Gore's family, The result was devastating. Their loved one had been killed inside her own home, and the woman who admitted causing her death was leaving the courtroom without a conviction. Outside the courtroom, the case remained deeply divisive. Some accepted the jury's conclusion that Candy had acted in self-defense. Others believed that 41 blows were incompatible with that explanation, and that the legal system had failed Betty. The most important unanswered question remained whether Betty had actually attacked Candy first. Because Betty was dead, that could never be independently confirmed. The jury had to make its decision without hearing from the other participant in the confrontation. Another question concerned the precise moment when self-defense, if it had begun, should have ended. The physical evidence demonstrated that Betty had suffered extensive injuries, but the jury had to determine what those injuries meant in the context of the struggle and Candy's psychological state. The defense had given them one possible explanation: dissociation. Under that theory, Candy was not acting with ordinary conscious control when she continued striking Betty. The prosecution offered another. Candy had sufficient awareness to stop and was therefore responsible for the continued violence. The jury ultimately accepted the defense sufficiently to acquit her. The result became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. The killing itself was shocking, but the acquittal created the lasting legal paradox that would define Candy Montgomery's story. A woman who acknowledged killing her friend could leave the courthouse legally innocent of the crime. For Betty's family, the verdict could not change what had happened inside the house. Betty was still dead. Her daughters had still lost their mother. Alan Gore was still returning to a life permanently altered by the killing. Was Candy genuinely fighting for her life? Was the extraordinary number of blows the result of psychological dissociation? Had the confrontation begun with Betty? Or had the violence gone far beyond anything required for self-defense? The jury answered only the legal question before it. It did not provide a final explanation of every moment inside the Gore home. The verdict, therefore, became both an ending and a beginning. Legally, the case against Candy was over. Publicly, however, the argument had only begun. In the years that followed, the story would remain a subject of books, documentaries, podcasts, and dramatic adaptations. But beneath the later cultural fascination was the same unresolved tragedy. On June 13, 1980, Betty Gore died violently in her own home, and the only person who survived the confrontation was the woman who said she had been defending herself. The verdict was not a declaration that Betty's death had been insignificant. It was a legal judgment about Candy's responsibility under the circumstances presented at trial. Yet for many people, the distinction was difficult to accept. The case had exposed the limits of what evidence could prove when a violent confrontation has only one surviving participant. It had also demonstrated how strongly a courtroom can turn on the interpretation of psychological evidence, especially when the physical facts appear to tell a story of their own. Candy Montgomery walked out of court acquitted. The verdict did not end the story of Betty Gore's death. In many ways, it created a second chapter, one that would last far beyond the courtroom in Collin County. Candy Montgomery had been acquitted, but the questions surrounding the killing did not disappear with the verdict. If anything, the decision made those questions more difficult, because the legal conclusion and the emotional understanding of what had happened remained deeply separated. For Betty's family, there could be no legal verdict capable of restoring the life that had been taken. Betty had been a wife, a mother, and a member of the same church community that had connected her family to Candy's. Her two daughters had lost their mother. Bethany, still an infant when Betty was killed, had been inside the home during the violence. The ordinary world that had existed around the Gore family was permanently changed. Alan Gore also had to live with the consequences. The relationship between Candy and Alan had begun as a secret arrangement that was supposed to remain separate from their families. Instead, the affair became part of the chain of events surrounding Betty's death. What had once been treated by the two participants as a controlled and private relationship eventually became central evidence in a murder investigation and a courtroom battle. The most enduring question remains the same one that divided investigators, lawyers, and the public. Why were there 41 blows? The case provides no definitive answer beyond Candy's claim that she was defending herself and the defense theory that she entered a dissociative psychological state. Some interpretations have viewed the number of injuries as evidence of overwhelming rage. Others have understood it as the possible result of extreme panic and psychological disconnection. But because Betty did not survive and there was no independent witness to the confrontation, the precise meaning of those 41 blows cannot be established with certainty from the information available. The question of whether Betty attacked first is equally unresolved. Candy said that she did. That claim became the foundation of the self-defense argument. Yet Betty could not give her own account. There was no second surviving participant to contradict or confirm the precise beginning of the struggle. The jury therefore had to decide whether Candy's explanation was sufficiently credible to justify an acquittal. The verdict demonstrates an important distinction between a legal judgment and a complete explanation of a tragedy. The jury found Candy not guilty. That meant the prosecution had not persuaded the jurors beyond the required legal standard that she was guilty of murder under the circumstances presented at trial. It did not mean that every question surrounding Betty's death had been answered. For many observers, the acquittal was difficult to reconcile with the physical evidence. 41 axe blows created an image of violence that seemed, on its face, incompatible with the ordinary idea of self-defense. The prosecution emphasized that point. Yet the defense offered the jury another way to understand the same evidence, arguing that Candy's psychological state had changed during the confrontation. Fred Fason's testimony about dissociation was therefore central to the defense's explanation. The argument was that Candy's reaction had been connected to childhood experiences in which she had been pressured to remain silent. When Betty allegedly shouted "shoo," the defense said that command triggered a deeply buried response. Candy was presented as someone whose ordinary control had been disrupted by a psychological reaction. Whether one accepts that explanation or questions it, it was powerful enough to become part of the jury's understanding of the case. It offered an answer to the most troubling contradiction in Candy's story. How could someone who appeared to be an ordinary church-going mother have inflicted such extraordinary violence on a friend? The case also raised questions about how people judge behavior after a traumatic event. Candy's actions after the killing became another dividing line. According to the investigation, she washed her feet and hands, left the house, and continued with the children's swimming plans. To some, this behavior suggested composure and therefore deliberate awareness. To Candy, it was consistent with shock. The same behavior could be interpreted in opposite ways, depending on the assumptions made about her state of mind. The case became part of American true crime culture, and Candy Montgomery became one of the most recognizable figures associated with controversial self-defense claims. It was later revisited through books, investigative accounts, podcasts, documentaries, and dramatic productions. But the continued fascination with Candy Montgomery should not obscure Betty Gore. At the center of the story is a woman whose life ended inside her own home. The details of the trial, the psychological theories, the affair, and the later adaptations can easily draw attention toward Candy because she was the surviving participant and because her acquittal created an unusually dramatic legal outcome. Yet the consequences were measured most painfully by the life Betty lost and the family she left behind. The case also illustrates how incomplete our understanding of violence can remain when the central event happens without witnesses. Investigators can document a crime scene. Medical examination can document injuries. Lawyers can reconstruct timelines. Experts can discuss psychological states. But none of those things can fully replace the testimony of the person who died. That absence is perhaps the most haunting element of the case. There is no final account from Betty explaining what she said that morning, what she intended, whether she reached for the axe first, what she thought when the confrontation began, or what she felt as the violence escalated. Her silence is not evidence of anything. It is simply the consequence of death, and it leaves the surviving accounts to carry an enormous weight. More than 4 decades later, the name Candy Montgomery remains attached to the killing of Betty Gore. The legal record ended with an acquittal, but the moral and historical debate never reached the same finality. Some people see a woman who survived a violent confrontation and was correctly acquitted. Others see a killing that should never have been justified as self-defense. Between those interpretations lies a set of facts that remain deeply unsettling. A friend entered a friend's house. An argument followed. An axe became the center of a struggle. Betty died. Candy survived. Investigators found 41 injuries. A courtroom heard competing explanations. A jury deliberated for approximately 8 hours and returned a verdict of not guilty. That is where the legal story ended. The human story did not. Betty's daughters grew up without their mother. Alan's family was permanently altered. Candy left Texas and eventually lived under another name. The community that had once connected the two families was forced to confront how little the appearance of a perfect life can reveal about the private conflicts within it. And perhaps that is why this case has endured. It is not only a story about an axe, an affair, or a controversial acquittal. It is a story about uncertainty. It asks how a jury decides what happened when the person who could explain the beginning of the violence is no longer alive. It asks how psychological evidence can change the meaning of physical evidence. And it reminds us that a legal verdict can close a case without resolving every question that human beings continue to ask. Betty Gore cannot answer those questions now. Candy's account remains the only surviving description of the confrontation itself. The jury accepted that account sufficiently to find her not guilty. Everything beyond that verdict belongs to the enduring debate surrounding the case. For Betty, however, there is no debate about the most fundamental fact. On June 13, 1980, her life ended inside her own home, leaving behind 2 daughters, a husband, and a story that would continue to be retold long after the courtroom doors closed. The tragedy remains because the verdict settled Candy's legal fate, but it could never restore Betty's life. Today, some criminal cases are remembered because investigators discover an ingenious clue. Others become famous because of an unexpected confession, a dramatic trial, or a verdict that reshapes public understanding of justice. The case of Candy Montgomery belongs to a different category. It is remembered because even after the investigation ended, the confession was made, and the jury reached its decision, the story still refused to provide emotional certainty. The law delivered an answer, but history continued asking questions. More than anything else, the killing of Betty Gore became a collision between 2 realities. One reality was visible and undeniable. Betty Gore died after suffering 41 axe wounds inside her own home in Wiley, Texas. Blood covered parts of the laundry area. The weapon was recovered at the scene, and Candy Montgomery admitted that she had killed her. These facts were never the subject of serious dispute. They formed the fixed foundation upon which every later argument was built. The second reality was invisible. It existed inside the brief confrontation between 2 women, with no surviving eyewitness except the person who delivered the fatal blows. What was said during those final moments? Did Betty truly take the axe first? Was Candy genuinely overwhelmed by fear? Did the struggle unfold exactly as Candy later described? Those questions could never be answered with complete certainty because the only person capable of challenging Candy's version was dead. That uncertainty explains why the case has continued to divide public opinion for decades. To understand its legacy, it is important to return to the extraordinary contradiction at its center. Candy Montgomery was not portrayed as a mysterious stranger passing through town. She was deeply woven into the same suburban church community as the Gore family. She was married, raising 2 children, participating in church activities, playing volleyball, and living the kind of life that many people associated with stability and respectability. Betty Gore occupied a remarkably similar world. She too was raising children, belonged to the same church, and shared friendships and social activities with Candy. Their families appeared to represent the same version of the American suburban dream. That similarity made the tragedy more disturbing than if the 2 women had been strangers. The violence did not emerge from an unknown criminal world. It emerged from a relationship built upon familiarity, trust, and shared community. Behind weekend gatherings and church friendships existed a secret affair that neither family could safely contain forever. The affair itself had already ended before Betty's death. According to the information provided, Alan confessed to Betty after she confronted him with her suspicions, and he told her that the relationship with Candy was over. Candy also accepted its end. Yet the emotional consequences of betrayal do not disappear simply because a relationship ends. The existence of that history became impossible to separate from the events of June 13, 1980. Still, the affair alone could not explain the killing. That distinction matters because it prevents the story from becoming too simple. It would be easy to reduce everything to jealousy, revenge, or betrayal. The actual case remained much more complicated. Candy did not deny killing Betty. Instead, she insisted that the confrontation became violent because Betty attacked first and that the fatal blows were delivered during a struggle for survival. The courtroom, therefore, did not revolve around proving identity. It revolved around interpreting intent, fear, and psychological response. That legal battle ultimately produced one of the most controversial acquittals in Texas history. For supporters of the verdict, the jury had fulfilled its responsibility by considering the evidence available rather than the emotional horror of the crime alone. They believed the absence of a direct eyewitness mattered enormously. They believed Candy's account of self-defense could not simply be dismissed because Betty was unable to provide another version. They also accepted the defense explanation that Candy experienced dissociation after a traumatic psychological trigger connected to childhood experiences. For critics, however, the physical violence overshadowed everything else. 41 axe wounds became impossible to separate from their understanding of justice. They questioned how repeated strikes, including injuries believed to have occurred when Betty was already close to losing the ability to resist, could remain within the boundaries of self-defense. They also focused on Candy's actions afterward, washing her feet and hands, leaving the house, and continuing with the children's swimming plans appeared to many people inconsistent with the behavior they expected from someone acting purely from panic. Neither interpretation erased the other. That is precisely why the case survived in public memory. Ordinary murder cases often become less mysterious once investigators identify the killer. Here, identification was immediate because Candy eventually admitted responsibility. Instead of ending the story, the confession opened a deeper debate. The public no longer asked who committed the act. They asked whether the act could legally and morally be understood through the lens of self-defense. The distinction between those two questions remains essential. A court determines legal responsibility according to evidence and the law. Public memory often operates differently. People remember emotion, imagery, and moral intuition. The image of a quiet suburban home transformed into a blood-covered crime scene is emotionally overwhelming. The fact that a baby remained alive in a nearby crib intensifies that sense of tragedy. The knowledge that the victim and the accused had once been friends through church adds another layer of heartbreak. Those emotional facts naturally influence how people remember the case, even though jurors were required to evaluate it according to legal standards. The verdict, therefore, became controversial not because everyone disagreed about what happened physically, but because they disagreed about what those physical events meant. The years that followed demonstrated how deeply the story had entered American culture. The case inspired books, investigative storytelling, podcasts, documentaries, and eventually 2 major dramatic television adaptations. In 2022, the series Candy introduced the story to a new generation of viewers, with Jessica Biel portraying Candy Montgomery. A year later, Love and Death offered another interpretation of the same case, with Elizabeth Olsen in the leading role. The existence of multiple dramatizations reveals something important about the story's cultural power. It contains no shortage of dramatic elements: friendship, infidelity, suburban religion, motherhood, psychological testimony, an axe killing, and an acquittal that shocked many observers. Yet those elements also created danger. The more famous the story becomes, the easier it is for audiences to become fascinated with the mystery while forgetting the person whose death made the story possible. Betty Gore was not simply the victim in someone else's narrative. She was the center of the tragedy. Any reflection on the case must begin with that truth. The lasting cultural attention surrounding Candy Montgomery often focuses on the extraordinary legal outcome because acquittals in admitted killings are rare and controversial. But Betty's death is the irreversible event around which every later book, television series, and podcast exists. She was the mother whose children were left without her. She was the wife whose husband discovered that a secret affair had connected 2 families before ending in unimaginable violence. She was the woman whose voice disappeared from the historical record at the exact moment when it mattered most. That silence has shaped the entire legacy of the case. Historians, journalists, legal commentators, and true crime audiences can examine evidence endlessly, but none of them can recreate Betty's testimony. No analysis can replace the missing perspective of the person who died. This creates an unavoidable imbalance. Candy's account survives because she lived. Betty's account survives only through the fragments of her life that existed before June 13th and through the physical evidence left after her death. It is one of the deepest ethical challenges in true crime storytelling. The surviving person naturally occupies more narrative space because there is more information about what they said, what they believed, and how they defended themselves. But greater narrative visibility should never become greater moral importance. Betty's absence should remind us that victims often become silent not because their stories are less significant, but because violence has taken away their ability to speak. The case also continues to provoke discussion about psychological evidence in criminal trials. Fred Fason's testimony introduced the idea that childhood trauma and dissociation could explain behavior that appeared otherwise incomprehensible. Whether people find that explanation persuasive or not, its influence on the jury demonstrates the power expert psychological testimony can have when physical evidence alone does not answer every legal question. Psychology did not erase the 41 wounds. Neither did it erase Candy's admission. Instead, it offered an interpretation of why those wounds occurred. That distinction is subtle but important. The defense was not arguing that Betty had survived. It was not arguing that Candy had been elsewhere. It was asking jurors to understand the killing through Candy's claimed psychological condition during an alleged life-threatening confrontation. The jury ultimately found that explanation sufficient to acquit her. That decision became the legal ending of the case. Yet legal endings and historical endings are rarely identical. For decades afterward, people continued returning to the same unresolved moments. Why did the conversation escalate? What exactly happened in the laundry room? Did Betty truly initiate the attack? At what point, if any, did the immediate danger end? Why did Candy continue striking? Was dissociation truly the best explanation? Or did the jury simply confront an impossible situation in which certainty was unattainable? The available facts cannot provide definitive answers beyond what was established at trial. Perhaps that is the final reason this case continues to resonate. It resists neat conclusions. It offers certainty where evidence exists and uncertainty where evidence disappears. The house in Wiley became the setting of an event that could be described physically in extraordinary detail, yet emotionally and psychologically it remains partially inaccessible. There is something profoundly unsettling about that contrast. A blood-covered room can be measured. 41 wounds can be counted. A verdict can be recorded. But fear cannot be photographed. Panic cannot be collected as physical evidence. Memory cannot be tested like bloodstains. Intent exists within the human mind, and when one of the two people involved dies, the surviving account inevitably carries a burden that no investigation can fully remove. Candy Montgomery eventually left Texas after the trial, divorced Pat Montgomery, moved to Georgia, changed her name to Candace Wheeler, and later worked as a mental health consultant. Her life continued outside the courtroom that had once made her one of the most discussed women in Texas. Betty Gore, by contrast, remained permanently fixed in public memory at the age and moment of her death. One woman had the opportunity to build another life. The other existed only through remembrance. That imbalance is not an argument about guilt or innocence. It is simply the human consequence of survival. When people revisit this case today, they often arrive searching for a definitive answer. They want to know whether Candy was a victim defending herself or a murderer who escaped punishment. The historical record provided here does not allow such certainty beyond the jury's verdict and Candy's own testimony. What it does provide is a framework for understanding why reasonable people have continued disagreeing for decades. The law answered one question. History preserved many others. And beneath every adaptation, every discussion, and every retelling remains the same quiet and devastating truth. On an ordinary June morning in 1980, a mother named Betty Gore opened the door to someone she knew, and by the end of that morning her life had been violently taken inside the home where her children should have been safest. That is the legacy that should endure beyond the controversy. Not merely the spectacle of an axe or the shock of an acquittal, but the reminder that behind every famous true crime case is a real victim whose absence continues long after the headlines fade. The story of Candy Montgomery may forever remain divided between competing interpretations, but the story of Betty Gore ends with a loss that no verdict, no television series, and no historical debate can ever undo. If you want to continue the script, the next natural chapter would be a closing epilogue that unifies all 7 parts into a powerful final ending for the complete podcast narrative. The story of Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery has endured because it leaves behind something more difficult than a simple mystery. It leaves a conflict between what can be established and what can never be known. Betty Gore died inside her home on June 13, 1980. Candy Montgomery admitted that she killed her. The weapon was an axe, and Betty suffered 41 blows. The jury ultimately accepted the defense claim of self-defense and found Candy not guilty. Those facts can be stated plainly. What cannot be stated with the same certainty is exactly what happened during the confrontation between the two women. Before that morning, Candy and Betty had shared many ordinary experiences of suburban life. Their families belonged to the same church community. They participated in activities together, including volleyball, outings, and social gatherings. Their lives appeared connected by friendship and routine. Yet hidden within that world was Candy's affair with Alan Gore, Betty's husband. The affair began in 1978 after Candy approached Alan and asked whether he wanted to have an affair. Alan initially refused, but eventually agreed. They attempted to keep the relationship controlled and separate from their families. They met during the day, used motels in nearby towns, avoided calling home while together, and agreed that the affair would not interfere with their marriages. Betty eventually suspected that Alan was unfaithful. After the birth of their second daughter, she was exhausted and experiencing signs of postpartum depression. She confronted Alan, and he admitted the affair, telling her that the relationship with Candy had ended. Candy also accepted the end of the relationship. Months later, Candy entered Betty's house to collect a swimsuit for her daughter. That simple purpose became the last ordinary moment in a story that would never again be ordinary. According to Candy's later account, Betty raised the subject of the affair. The conversation became a confrontation, and the two moved toward the laundry area, where an axe was present. Candy said Betty took the axe first. She said they struggled, that she gained control of it, and that she struck Betty in self-defense. Everything that followed depends upon how that account is understood. The crime scene established the terrible result. Betty had been struck 41 times. The wounds included injuries to her head, face, shoulders, back, and legs. Blood was found on the walls, the door, the floor, and the washing machine. The axe was covered in blood. Investigators believe that some injuries occurred when Betty was already close to being unable to resist. For the prosecution, those facts challenged the claim of self-defense. For the defense, they required another explanation. That explanation was psychological. Candy's attorney, Don Crowder, argued that she had experienced a trauma-related response connected to her childhood. Expert witness Fred Faison testified about dissociation and the possibility that Candy's reaction had been triggered when Betty shouted "shoo." The defense argued that this command connected with Candy's childhood experiences and that she entered a dissociative state in which her normal control over her actions was disrupted. The prosecution rejected that interpretation and emphasized the 41 blows, Candy's actions after the killing, and the absence of any call for emergency help. Candy had washed her hands and feet, left the house, and continued with the children's swimming plans. To critics, those actions suggested composure. Candy described them as behavior occurring while she was in shock. Again, the evidence allowed competing interpretations. That is why the trial mattered so much. The jury was not deciding whether Candy had caused Betty's death. She admitted that. The jury was deciding whether the circumstances justified treating the killing as self-defense. After approximately 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Candy Montgomery was found not guilty. The verdict became the most controversial part of the case for many observers. To those who accepted the defense, the decision recognized the possibility that Candy had faced a genuine threat and reacted under extreme psychological pressure. To those who rejected it, the number and distribution of Betty's injuries made the idea of self-defense impossible to accept. But a verdict cannot recreate a lost moment. The jury could not ask Betty what she had intended that morning. Betty could not tell them whether she had reached for the axe first. She could not explain what was said before the struggle. She could not describe the moment when the confrontation became fatal. Her absence created a permanent boundary around the truth. That boundary is important when remembering the case today. It is tempting to turn the story into a simple choice between two characters, the woman who killed and the woman who died. But the history is more complicated. Candy was the accused killer and the only surviving participant in the confrontation. Betty was the victim whose own perspective disappeared forever. Alan was the husband whose affair became part of the circumstances. Their children were left with the consequences of an event they did not create. The case also reminds us how easily an outwardly orderly life can conceal private conflict. Both families were part of a community organized around church, family, work, and social relationships. From the outside, their lives could appear stable. Yet the affair between Candy and Alan existed beneath that surface, and its discovery changed the relationship between the two families permanently. Still, it would be wrong to suggest that the affair automatically explains Betty's death. Candy maintained that the killing occurred because Betty attacked her, and the defense built its case around that claim. The jury accepted the defense sufficiently to acquit her. The available information does not establish a simple motive of revenge or jealousy. That is where responsible retelling must stop speculation. There is no need to invent a final motive where the evidence does not establish one. There is no need to decide with certainty what happened in a room where only one participant survived. The most honest conclusion is also the most difficult. Some parts of the confrontation remain unknowable. What is knowable is that Betty's life ended violently. What is knowable is that her children lost their mother. What is knowable is that the affair, once hidden, became inseparable from the investigation. What is knowable is that Candy admitted responsibility, claimed self-defense, presented a psychological explanation through the defense, and was acquitted. After the trial, Candy divorced Pat Montgomery, moved to Georgia, changed her name to Candace Wheeler, and later worked as a mental health consultant. Betty, meanwhile, remained permanently associated with the case that took her life. The later cultural attention brought the story to new audiences. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and television productions revisited the events. In 2022, Candy portrayed the story with Jessica Biel as Candy Montgomery. In 2023, Love and Death offered another dramatization, with Elizabeth Olsen portraying Candy. These productions demonstrate how strongly the case continues to capture public attention. But dramatization can never solve the central uncertainty. A television series can recreate a conversation. A book can reconstruct a timeline. A documentary can examine the evidence. None can recover Betty's voice. That is perhaps the most important lesson in the entire story. True crime can become fascinated with the accused because the accused can speak. The accused can explain, remember, or reinterpret. The victim cannot. In Betty's case, that silence is absolute. Her perspective exists only through what others knew about her before the killing and through the circumstances documented afterward. That distinction keeps the story grounded in its human consequences. Betty was more than the victim in a famous case. She was a mother and wife whose absence continued after the courtroom proceedings ended. The case remains compelling because it cannot be reduced to a single sentence. It is a story about friendship, secrecy, family, violence, psychological interpretation, law, and uncertainty. Most importantly, it is a story about a woman whose final account can never be heard. Candy Montgomery left the courtroom acquitted. Betty Gore could not leave hers alive. That difference defines the tragedy more than any later argument. The unanswered questions may remain forever, but the loss does not. On June 13, 1980, a mother died inside her home. Her family was changed forever, and a case that ended legally continued in memory. The verdict settled Candy's legal fate, but it could never restore Betty's life or provide the missing account of those final moments. That remains the central human truth. The courtroom had reached its conclusion, but the questions surrounding Betty Gore's death did not disappear. Candy Montgomery had been acquitted, and legally that decision ended the prosecution against her. Yet for those who continued to examine the case, the verdict did not provide an explanation for every detail of that June morning. Instead, it left behind a collection of unanswered questions, each connected to the same brief and violent confrontation inside Betty's home. The first question was the simplest to ask and the hardest to answer. What exactly happened between Candy and Betty before the axe was used? The available account tells us that Candy entered the house to collect a swimsuit for her daughter. Alan was away on business. Betty was home with her children. Candy and Betty spoke for several minutes before the subject of the affair entered the conversation. From there, the situation escalated, and the women moved toward the laundry area where an axe was present. But the precise words exchanged between them are unknown. That missing conversation matters because it represents the final bridge between an ordinary visit and a fatal confrontation. There is no complete record of what Betty said. There is no complete record of what Candy said. The argument survives only through the later account presented by Candy and the evidence investigators found after Betty's death. That absence creates a permanent uncertainty. Candy said Betty was the first to take the axe. If that account is accepted, then the beginning of the confrontation can be understood as an act of aggression against Candy. The struggle over the weapon would then become the critical moment in which Candy believed she needed to protect herself. But the question cannot be independently confirmed. Betty was the person who could have provided the other side of that story, and she was no longer alive to do so. There was no independent eyewitness to tell investigators which woman reached for the weapon first. That meant the jury had to consider Candy's account without the possibility of hearing directly from the other participant. The second question concerns the 41 blows. The number is one of the most disturbing facts in the case because it seems to demand an explanation. If Candy was defending herself, why did the confrontation result in so many strikes? The prosecution used that question to challenge the defense. 41 blows suggested to the state that the violence had continued beyond the point of immediate danger. Some of the injuries were found on Betty's head, face, shoulders, back, and legs, and investigators believe that some occurred when she was already close to being unable to resist. The defense offered a different interpretation. Candy's attorney argued that she had experienced a dissociative reaction. Expert witness Fred Faison connected that reaction to Candy's childhood experiences and to Betty's use of the word "shoo" during the confrontation. Under the defense theory, Candy was no longer operating with ordinary psychological control as the violence continued. The jury accepted enough of that explanation to find Candy not guilty. Yet the verdict did not establish precisely why the 41 blows occurred. It established the legal outcome. Those are not necessarily the same thing. The third question concerns the moment when self-defense, if it existed, ended. This may be the most difficult legal and moral issue in the case. Even if Betty had attacked first, a defensive action could potentially continue only while a person perceived an immediate threat. The prosecution argued that Candy had time to stop and that the extent of the injuries demonstrated that the violence went beyond ordinary self-defense. The defense responded through the psychological explanation of dissociation. If Candy had genuinely entered a state in which her normal control was disrupted, then the meaning of those continued blows would be different. Again, the jury had to choose between interpretations rather than simply between physical facts. The fourth question concerns Candy's behavior after the killing. According to the investigation, she washed her hands and feet before leaving the house. She did not call for emergency assistance. She continued with the children's swimming plans. Those actions became significant because people naturally look to behavior after a violent event for clues about a person's state of mind. The prosecution viewed Candy's behavior as evidence of composure and awareness. Critics saw it as inconsistent with the behavior expected from someone who had just survived a terrifying attack. Candy described her state differently. She said she had been in shock. There is no simple way to transform behavior into certainty about psychological state. The same action can be interpreted differently depending on what happened inside the person's mind. That ambiguity became another unresolved feature of the case. The fifth question involves the affair itself. It is tempting to treat the relationship between Candy and Alan as the explanation for everything that followed. But the facts do not establish that Candy killed Betty simply because of the affair. The relationship had been exposed, Alan had told Betty it was over, and Candy had accepted its end. The affair provides essential context, but context is not automatically motive. What it does establish is that Candy and Betty were connected through a deeply personal secret. Betty knew that her husband had been involved with Candy. Candy knew that Betty knew. Alan stood between them as both husband and former affair partner. The emotional consequences of that situation were impossible to separate from the morning when the two women confronted one another. Still, the exact emotional state of either woman cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The sixth question is about Betty herself. Because the story has become so strongly associated with Candy, it can be easy for Betty to disappear behind the controversy surrounding her death. But Betty's life existed independently of the case. She was a wife, a mother, and a member of the same community that had once brought her family and Candy's family together. She had two daughters. The younger was still an infant when Betty was killed. That detail changes the way the story should be remembered. The case is not simply about an accused woman, an unusual defense, and a controversial acquittal. It is also about the consequences of losing a mother. Whatever interpretation one accepts regarding Candy's actions, Betty's daughters experienced the irreversible consequence of her death. The seventh question concerns justice itself. What does an acquittal mean when the person who caused a death admits responsibility? The answer is that criminal responsibility depends on more than establishing that one person caused another person's death. The circumstances and legal justification matter. Candy admitted killing Betty, but claimed self-defense. The jury considered the evidence, including the psychological defense, and found her not guilty. For those who believe Candy, the verdict represented justice because it recognized the possibility that she had acted to protect herself. For those who rejected her explanation, the verdict represented a failure because Betty had suffered 41 axe wounds and Candy walked free. Both reactions became part of the case's legacy. The eighth question concerns the limits of evidence. Investigators could document the crime scene. They could identify the weapon. They could establish the number and location of injuries. They could learn about the affair. They could obtain Candy's admission. But they could not document the exact sequence of movements inside the laundry area because there was no independent surviving witness. This is one of the most important facts to remember when evaluating the case. Evidence can be extensive without being complete. The physical evidence tells us what happened to Betty's body. It does not, by itself, provide a complete psychological account of Candy's experience. Likewise, Candy's account provides her understanding of the confrontation, but it cannot independently establish everything that Betty did. Between those two sources lies the uncertainty that has kept the case alive. The ninth question concerns what happened after the trial. Candy eventually left Texas, divorced Pat Montgomery, moved to Georgia, changed her name to Candace Wheeler, and later worked as a mental health consultant. She largely disappeared from public attention for years. Betty, however, remained connected to the case through memory. The contrast is striking. One woman continued living after the verdict. The other could only be remembered through the tragedy that ended her life. That difference is unavoidable, but it also demonstrates why true crime storytelling requires care. The surviving figure often becomes the center of the narrative because there is more information about her. She can explain herself. She can become the subject of books and television programs. Her choices can be analyzed for decades. The victim cannot participate in that process. Betty cannot answer the questions that people still ask. She cannot explain whether she attacked first. She cannot clarify what she said during the argument. She cannot describe her intentions. She cannot challenge Candy's memories. The absence of her testimony should therefore remain central to any responsible understanding of the case. The 10th and final question is perhaps the one that has no answer at all. Could the tragedy have been prevented? The information available does not allow us to say. The affair had ended. The families remained connected through their community. Candy went to Betty's house for an ordinary reason. Nothing in the provided account establishes that either woman entered the house expecting a fatal confrontation. Then the conversation changed. A secret that had once been hidden became part of a confrontation. An ordinary household object became a weapon. A friendship ended in violence. And an infant remained in the house while her mother died. That sequence is devastating precisely because it begins with something so ordinary. There was no grand setting. No elaborate plan is established by the evidence provided. There was simply a suburban home, two women, a history of personal conflict, and a moment that cannot be reconstructed completely. The legal system ultimately answered the question it was required to answer. The jury found Candy Montgomery not guilty. But history has continued asking questions that a verdict could never resolve. Was Candy telling the truth? Was Betty truly the aggressor? Did dissociation explain the 41 blows? Did the violence continue after the danger had ended? Why did Candy behave as she did afterward? The available record can describe the arguments on both sides, but it cannot provide certainty where the evidence itself remains incomplete. And perhaps that is the most honest way to remember the case. Not as a story with a perfect ending, but as a tragedy defined by an absence of answers. Betty Gore's death became famous because the circumstances were extraordinary. But the deepest lesson is ordinary and painful. Human relationships can contain secrets that remain invisible until they become impossible to contain. A community can appear stable while private lives are complicated beneath the surface. And a single confrontation can permanently destroy several families. The case remains controversial because the jury's verdict settled Candy's legal fate without settling the meaning of those final moments. That meaning remains suspended between Candy's account, the physical evidence, the psychological testimony, and the silence of the woman who could have told the other side. Betty Gore never received the opportunity to tell her story. That is the question that remains after everything else has been examined. Not simply whether Candy was guilty or innocent, but what Betty would have said if she had survived. We will never know. The story of Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore did not remain confined to the courtroom in Collin County. After the verdict, the case continued to live in public memory because it contained a contradiction that was difficult to forget. Candy had admitted killing Betty, yet a jury found her not guilty after accepting the defense argument that she had acted in self-defense. That result transformed the case from a shocking homicide into a lasting debate about law, psychology, evidence, and the limits of certainty. Betty's story followed a different path. She remained remembered primarily through the circumstances of her death. Her life before June 13, 1980, can be described through the family and community she shared with Alan, her role as a mother, and her connection to the same church community as Candy. But after her death, the public naturally became fascinated by the questions surrounding the killing. The woman who could have provided the missing account of the confrontation was no longer able to speak. That imbalance is one of the most important things to recognize when looking back at the case. Candy could describe what she believed had happened. Betty could not. Candy could tell the jury that Betty had taken the axe first. Betty could not confirm or deny that claim. Candy could describe her own psychological state. Betty could not explain her intentions or emotional state during the confrontation. The legal system had to work with that imbalance because there was no alternative. This does not mean that Candy's account was necessarily false. It means only that the most important part of her account could never be independently verified by the person who had been there with her. The physical evidence provided another form of testimony, but it also had limits. Betty had suffered 41 axe wounds. Investigators documented blood throughout the area, including the walls, door, floor, and washing machine. The weapon was covered in blood. The injuries affected several parts of Betty's body, including her head, face, shoulders, back, and legs. Some injuries appeared to have occurred when Betty was already close to being unable to resist. Those facts were powerful, but physical evidence does not speak for itself. It must be interpreted within a sequence of events. The prosecution interpreted the injuries as evidence that the violence went beyond self-defense. The defense interpreted the same violence through Candy's claim of a psychological reaction during the struggle. The jury ultimately accepted the defense. That decision remains controversial because people often approach the case through different definitions of what justice should accomplish. For some, justice meant recognizing that a person facing a violent attack should be allowed to defend herself, even if the response was extreme. For others, justice required accountability for the 41 blows and the suffering Betty endured. It is also important to distinguish the emotional reaction to the number 41 from the legal question the jury was required to decide. 41 is an extraordinary number, and it naturally shapes the way people imagine the crime. But the jury was not asked simply whether the number of wounds was horrifying. The jury had to determine whether Candy's conduct was legally justified under the circumstances presented, and whether the defense explanation created sufficient doubt about criminal responsibility. The psychological evidence became central to that decision. Don Crowder's defense did not attempt to erase the violence. Instead, it offered a theory for why Candy might have continued striking Betty. Fred Faison testified about dissociation and connected the claimed reaction to Candy's childhood experiences. The defense argued that Betty's use of the word "show" triggered a deeply buried response and that Candy entered a psychological state in which her ordinary control was disrupted. For the time in which the trial occurred, this was an unusual approach. It gave the jury a framework for considering conduct that otherwise seemed almost impossible to reconcile with Candy's outward identity as a wife, mother, church member, and member of a close suburban community. The prosecution challenged that framework by focusing on the practical details of what Candy did after the killing. She washed her hands and feet, left the house, and continued with the children's swimming plans. She did not call for emergency help. The state argued that these actions demonstrated a level of awareness and control inconsistent with the defense theory. Candy's supporters could interpret those same actions differently, seeing them as behavior occurring under shock. Again, the facts remained the same while the meaning changed. That pattern is the reason the case continues to generate discussion. Almost every major fact contains two possible interpretations. The affair can be seen as background or motive. The axe can be seen as a weapon of attack or an object taken during a struggle. The 41 blows can be viewed as evidence of excessive violence or as the result of psychological dissociation. Candy's behavior afterward can be viewed as calculated or as shock. The verdict can be seen as a proper application of self-defense or as a failure of justice. Its cultural legacy grew partly because of this uncertainty. The story inspired books, investigative accounts, podcasts, documentaries, and dramatic television adaptations. In 2022, Candy brought the case to television audiences with Jessica Biel portraying Candy Montgomery. In 2023, Love and Death offered another dramatization, with Elizabeth Olsen portraying Candy. A responsible retelling must resist that imbalance. Betty was not created by the trial. She did not exist simply as a character in Candy's story. She was a mother whose children needed her, a wife whose family depended upon her, and a person who belonged to a community before she became the center of a famous murder case. Her death affected people whose lives continued after the verdict, particularly her daughters and Alan. The infant Bethany was still in the house when Betty was killed. That detail places the tragedy in its most painful human context. This was not an abstract legal dispute. It was the death of a mother inside the home where her children were present. When people ask whether Betty really attacked Candy first, the available information provides Candy's account, but no surviving independent confirmation. When people ask why there were 41 blows, the evidence establishes the number and locations of the injuries, while the defense provides a psychological explanation. When people ask why Candy left without calling for help, the investigation establishes what she did, but it cannot independently establish exactly what she was thinking. The case of Betty Gore is one of those stories. The law closed the criminal proceeding with Candy's acquittal. Candy later moved away and lived under another name. Betty remained dead, her life permanently defined in public memory by the final morning she spent inside her home. That difference should shape the way the case is remembered. The most compelling part of the story is not simply that Candy walked free. It is that the legal system had to make a decision in a case where certainty was impossible. The jury had to evaluate the testimony, physical evidence, psychological theory, and circumstances surrounding the confrontation. After approximately 8 hours, they reached their conclusion. Whether every observer agrees with that conclusion is another matter. But the verdict remains a fact of the case. So does Betty's death. So does Candy's admission. So do the 41 wounds. So does the absence of Betty's testimony. Taken together, those facts form a story that cannot be reduced to a single interpretation. The case remains controversial because it sits at the boundary between evidence and uncertainty, between legal judgment and moral judgment, between what can be proven and what can only be remembered. Perhaps that is why the story continues to return in new forms. Each generation encounters the same case and asks the same questions, hoping that another perspective might finally resolve what happened. But no later book, documentary, podcast, or television series can recover the one voice that is missing. Betty Gore's voice is the silence at the center of the entire story. Everything else is an attempt to understand what happened around that silence. And that is where the legacy of the case ultimately rests. Not in a perfect answer, but in the recognition that some tragedies remain permanently divided between what we know, what we believe, and what we will never be able to know. The final part of this story does not begin with another discovery, another witness, or another courtroom revelation. There is none. The case of Betty Gore has already reached its legal conclusion, and the central facts have been examined from every direction available in the record provided. What remains is the human meaning of what happened, and the uncomfortable space between a verdict and an answer. On June 13, 1980, Betty Gore died inside her own home in Wiley, Texas. She was 40 years old, a wife, a mother, and a member of the same church community that had connected her family to Candy Montgomery's family. By the end of that morning, the ordinary world surrounding both families had been permanently destroyed. The violence that ended Betty's life was extraordinary in its severity. She was struck 41 times with an axe. The injuries affected her head, face, shoulders, back, and legs. Blood was found across the laundry area, including the walls, door, floor, and washing machine. The weapon was covered in blood. Nearby, Betty's infant daughter remained alive in her crib. These facts are difficult to absorb because the setting was so ordinary. This was not a remote location or an unfamiliar environment. It was a family home. It was a place associated with children, marriage, routine, and safety. Yet within that space, a friendship between two women ended in fatal violence. The story becomes even more difficult because Candy and Betty had not been strangers. They had belonged to the same community. Their families had spent time together. They had participated in social activities, played volleyball, attended church events, and shared the ordinary connections of suburban life. Behind that familiar world, however, was the affair between Candy and Alan Gore. Candy had approached Alan in 1978 and asked whether he wanted to have an affair. Alan initially refused, but eventually agreed. They attempted to structure the relationship according to rules intended to keep it separate from their marriages. They met during the day, used motels in nearby towns, avoided calling home while together, and agreed that their relationship would not interfere with their families. The arrangement eventually became known to Betty. After the birth of her second daughter, Betty was experiencing exhaustion and signs of postpartum depression. She suspected that Alan was involved with someone else and confronted him. Alan admitted the affair, but said that it had ended. Candy also accepted that the relationship was over. Yet the past did not disappear simply because the affair ended. On the morning of June 13th, Candy went to Betty's house to collect a swimsuit for her daughter. The visit had an ordinary purpose. Alan was away on business. Betty was home with her children. At some point, the conversation turned toward the affair. From that point onward, the evidence becomes increasingly dependent on Candy's account. Candy said that Betty took the axe first. She said the women struggled and that she gained control of the weapon. She maintained that she then struck Betty in self-defense. The prosecution offered a very different interpretation. The state emphasized the 41 blows, the locations of the injuries, and the evidence suggesting that some strikes occurred when Betty was already close to being unable to resist. Prosecutors also emphasized Candy's behavior afterward. She washed her hands and feet, left the house, and continued with the children's swimming plans. She did not call emergency services. To the prosecution, these details raised serious doubts about the claim of self-defense. The defense responded by presenting a psychological explanation. Attorney Don Crowder argued that Candy experienced a dissociative reaction connected to childhood trauma. Expert witness Fred Faison testified about that possibility and connected it to Betty's use of the word "shoo" during the confrontation. According to the defense, Candy's psychological response could explain why the violence continued. This argument did not erase the physical evidence. It attempted to explain it. That distinction became the center of the trial. The jury eventually had to decide whether Candy's account of self-defense was sufficiently credible and whether the psychological evidence supported her explanation of the violence. After approximately 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Candy Montgomery was not guilty. That verdict remains one of the most controversial elements of the case. Some people see it as evidence that the legal system recognized the possibility of a genuine act of self-defense under extraordinary circumstances. Others believe that 41 axe blows could not reasonably be understood as necessary defensive action and that the verdict failed Betty. Both reactions have persisted because the verdict cannot answer questions that the evidence itself cannot fully resolve. The most important unanswered question remains whether Betty actually attacked first. Candy was the only surviving participant in the confrontation. Betty could not tell investigators what happened. There was no independent eyewitness to provide a complete account of the struggle. Because of that, the jury was required to evaluate Candy's version against the physical evidence and the arguments presented by both sides. That limitation should never be forgotten. A legal verdict is not necessarily a perfect reconstruction of reality. Courts work with evidence, testimony, and legal standards. They cannot summon a dead witness back into the courtroom. They cannot recreate every movement that occurred during a violent confrontation. They can only reach the best decision possible from the information available. The jury decided that the evidence did not justify a guilty verdict. Candy was therefore free to leave the courtroom. Betty could never leave the house where she died. That contrast is perhaps the most painful image left by the entire case. One woman's future continued. The other woman's future ended permanently. Candy later divorced Pat Montgomery, moved to Georgia, changed her name to Candace Wheeler, and eventually worked as a mental health consultant. Betty remained present in public memory through the circumstances of her death. Over time, the case became part of American true crime culture. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and television programs returned to the same events. The television series Candy appeared in 2022, with Jessica Biel portraying Candy Montgomery. Love and Death followed in 2023, with Elizabeth Olsen portraying Candy. The continued attention demonstrates how powerful the story remains, but it also creates a responsibility for anyone who tells it. The danger of a famous true crime case is that the accused can become more recognizable than the victim. The accused can speak. The accused can explain. The accused can become the center of interviews, books, dramatizations, and public debate. The victim cannot. Betty's silence is permanent. She cannot explain what she said that morning. She cannot tell us whether she reached for the axe first. She cannot describe what she felt during the confrontation. She cannot respond to the psychological explanation presented in court. She cannot correct or confirm Candy's memory. That absence should make us cautious. It should also make us compassionate. The most important legacy of the case is not the image of the axe, the shock of the 41 wounds, or the fascination surrounding an acquittal. Those elements explain why the case became famous, but they do not explain why the story should matter. It should matter because a person died. It should matter because a family lost a mother. It should matter because 2 children grew up with the permanent absence of Betty Gore. It should matter because the case demonstrates how fragile ordinary relationships can become when secrecy, betrayal, fear, and conflict exist beneath the surface. And it should matter because the legal system sometimes has to make decisions in circumstances where complete certainty is impossible. The case does not offer a comfortable ending. There is no final piece of evidence that transforms every uncertainty into certainty. There is no surviving witness who can settle the argument. There is no later confession that changes the meaning of the verdict. There is only the record. There is Candy's admission that she killed Betty. There is Candy's claim that she acted in self-defense. There is the physical evidence of 41 axe wounds. There is the psychological testimony concerning dissociation. There is the prosecution's argument that the violence exceeded what self-defense could justify. There is the jury's decision to acquit. And there is Betty's silence. Together, those facts create a story that has remained unresolved in the public imagination for decades. Perhaps the most responsible conclusion is therefore not to pretend that the mystery can be solved. It is to acknowledge the boundaries of what is known. And Betty's silence remains the final boundary that no one can cross.